Welcome to the Relational Recovery podcast. I'm your host, Wes Thompson. Today I'm joined by guest Matthew Demoulin. He is on staff with me at the Refuge Ministries, which is a recovery ministry in Central Ohio, where we serve men 18 years and older. Today we're talking about the courage to be honest and how honesty plays a role in addiction and recovery. We hope this conversation is helpful. Thanks for listening. Matthew, how's it going today?
It's going good. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for joining me. I'm excited to jump into the podcast together. Today we're talking, I think we're titling this The Courage to Be Honest. I think honesty is obviously an important topic when we talk about our own personal development. But I want to talk today about it in the context of addiction. I think honesty is something I've been thinking about a lot lately because it's really, on the surface, it sounds pretty straightforward. I think most people would agree that we don't want to be liars, that we want to tell the truth. I mean, even as I've got young kids, teaching them to tell the truth is a good thing. I think most people in the world would agree with that. But when it comes to addiction, when it comes to our own personal development, I think it gets tricky because honesty becomes a really tough thing in practice. It's easy to tell the truth about things that are pretty straightforward, but I think whenever we start to struggle, when we start to deal with unwanted behaviors, things that manifest in the form of addiction, honesty gets really difficult because it requires vulnerability. We can feel exposed. There's sometimes shame around the fact that, we're admitting that we don't have it all together. And I think there's, another thing we're going to talk about at some point here probably is just there's often a component of denial where when we're struggling with things, sometimes we don't fully see ourselves in our truest form. We don't live in reality. We can minimize some of the struggles, and unfortunately, oftentimes maybe we don't get fully honest until sometimes the house is burning down and we don't, and our life is completely unmanageable. So honesty is incredibly important in our own pursuit of being healthy relationally, with ourselves, with others, with God, etc. But it can be a real challenge, and so maybe to start off, we can just talk about why honesty is so difficult. So when you think about this, as I just set that up, is there anything that comes to mind for you in your own story or just anything in general when we think about honesty and the difficulties of it?
Yeah, I think, well, I don't think, this is factual that, mental health and addiction is, two of the most stigmatized conditions that exist. And so I feel like initially when you're in addiction, and you want to come out and maybe speak with those that you care about and say, I have a problem, there's a lot of fear there because obviously, how are they going to receive this? How am I going to be viewed? How am I going to be judged? Labeling. We all love labeling, right? Human beings. We label everything. We label food. We label experiences. But we're really good at labeling people. It's almost like an easy ability. I know I'm guilty of it. I can meet somebody and without knowing anything about them, based on our encounter, like I might label this individual just initially on an impression and do it so relatively naively and ignorantly. But yeah, labeling is always individualized. It's person to person. But I think labeling has a nasty side to it. For example, we label people based on gifts and abilities. All of us, including myself, like I was somebody before the addiction. And I was labeled typically by, my gifts, my abilities, how people saw me. I played sports, and so I was recognized as an athlete. I did well in school, so I was, recognized of, some type of intelligence, from my family. But the like I said, the nasty side of labeling is the minute I became an addict, I was no longer Matthew the athletic, smart individual. I was Matthew the addict. And so on a negative side, labeling always replaces your most identifiable trait. And if that most identifiable trait is negative, then you become that thing. And then stigma takes it a step further, right? Stigma is group to group, or it's societal. It's not individualized. And so then, therefore, because now I'm Matthew the addict, therefore I have all these stereotypes that go with addiction, whether they're true or not. And so I know for a lot of people, including myself, I remember, the first time I came to my parents and I said I had a problem, you know, and I feel like a lot of people, they respond subconsciously. They don't even realize it. But like my own family started treating me different just by their own impressions. I mean, we're all conditioned from, what we read, what we see, how we were raised, what we were taught. And we all kind of like, I think all of us can close our eyes and picture like a caricature of like what an addict looks like, and some things and behaviors. And so by me just coming out, like I would go to family parties, and all of a sudden it's just like people were watching their purses a little bit more closely. These are people that have known me since the beginning, and never once at that point have I stolen anything. But yet they were starting to treat me different just based on a confession to them. And like that hurts, it does.
Man, that's really helpful to hear. You mentioned the stigma, and you're alluding to the shame, right? I'm not good enough. I don't feel like I'm good enough. People are treating me differently. Obviously, all those things play a part in our ability to be vulnerable when people start to treat us differently. So I start to hide, or I start to cover up. It's easy to begin to pretend, and maybe even to try to put on a face, or a mask to cover up what's really happening.
Uh-huh.
So honesty becomes really difficult, in general, because trust is difficult, because we don't know if people are actually going to accept us or help us. And so that becomes really tricky, and it becomes really tricky. It becomes really difficult. So then the question is kind of like, who can I be honest with? What does honesty look like? Who do I tell? Who can I trust? Not everyone is safe. Not everyone maybe is even mature enough to handle this truth. And so I think for many of us, especially early in recovery, this circle of people that we feel safe with is small. Maybe some people don't feel like they even have anyone they can go to. maybe there's a counselor, maybe there's a pastor, um, a sponsor, etc. But maybe it feels like there's nobody. So I don't know. In your story, like how did that happen? When did you have a safe person? Were you able, like how did that? Who did you feel like you could talk to?
Yeah, for me, it was always my mom, you know, like she was kind of um, my confidant. She was my encourager. Um, she was always the one that tried to give me hope. Um, but also too, it's just like my mom had no education on how to handle addiction. And so she must have felt, and I feel like this also happens for a lot of people, it's just like she must have felt inadequate and uncomfortable with, well, how do I help them? What do I do? What do I say? And like, you know, some of her favorite words to me would always just be like, very practical. Well, just stop doing drugs and things will get better. Because that's in her life. That's what, if she had a bad behavior, she would start doing it, stop doing it, and then like things would change. But this wasn't like, you know, learning to show up on time. And so she was always my go-to. And I didn't really. I learned to not talk to my dad because my dad was always very negative, and more. And my mom's the optimist. My dad's the pessimistic person. So my every time I felt like I would be doing good, and then I would slip up and be back in addiction. And I was always good at hiding it from them for the most part. And they usually knew that I was struggling because I would be going through withdrawals. And a lot of the times I would try to go back to their house and just kind of get back on my feet, but I would obviously be dope sick. And, my mom was always the encourager. And then my dad was always just like, there we go again. It's the same old thing. It just keeps repeating itself. And so it's just like my dad acted like society, where it's just like you're doing the same stuff. Nothing's ever going to change. And so it's like I think, and I don't think he really meant that, but he was going through his own pain and struggle of watching me slowly deteriorate over the years, and he didn't know how to respond. And so it's like he was just responding in a way that only he knew how to respond. And so I'm sure his intention. And that's the thing. That's the difficulty thing with labeling and stigma is just like we respond, and I'm sure our intentions. I'm sure my dad's intentions weren't to like kick me further into the ground, but ultimately, like that's what would happen. He would push me further away, um, and that's hard. And then it's the next thing past stigma is like self stigma. And I feel like every addict who's especially been in an addiction for that long, they adapt that. And self stigma is just simply you believe what society says about you. You attach it and then you internalize it and then you say, I am those things. And we've all heard the once an addict's always an addict. And I can't tell you how many addicts at a certain point start to believe that about themselves. Well, they say it. Nothing's changed over the years, so they're probably right. And so therefore now I'm always going to be an addict and nothing's ever going to change. And then it's just like, well, who cares what I do? Let me just jump further into this. And so self-esteem is one of those things where it's like once you start believing what people and society says about you, you lose hopelessness. And then it's a crash and burn. Because then, like you said, you don't trust anybody. You don't even trust yourself. You don't even know what the difference is between truth and not truth. Um, and it's a slippery slope.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. I think I want to shift to thinking about denial. Denial plays a big role in this, right? Because, and I think sometimes when we think about addiction, we often think about right the worst case scenario. We think of people like on heroin or fentanyl, or in our day, like we think of the worst case. But oftentimes, addiction can manifest in good things that are done too much, like overdone. Workaholism, for example. We overlook some addictions, like people that can't, eat appropriately, which is like something that I continue to, like we all, I think, try to do better at, or exercise. But it's like we we often look at our struggles as being not that bad. I'm in control of this. I can stop at any time. Everybody has issues. We minimize, right? And and we've all got these blind spots, and in our blind spots we don't see things clearly. I really like, one of my mentors, Rich Plass, he always says it this way. He says the litmus test, as we're thinking, like if everything, we call this podcast Relational Recovery, right? And we see life through the lens of relationships. We think that we're made by a relational God. We're made to be relational. Rich Plass always says, the litmus test is how is your behavior showing up relationally? That's how you know where you're at. So like, for example, if I'm justifying myself overworking, well, how's my overworking showing up relationally? How's it showing up in the relationship with my wife, in the relationship with my kids, in my case? Is it causing problems, or is it causing relational flourishing? And I think it's easy with our behaviors to be in a state of denial, whether we're comparing ourselves to somebody that we perceive to be worse than we are. Oh, well, I'm better than him, or I'm better than her. Um, and I think it's really easy to stay in this place of denial, because addiction thrives in denial and in secrecy. And I think the point we're trying to make is that recovery thrives in truth and honesty. and obviously in community, which is relationships. So I don't know, when you think about the component of just denial, of not seeing what's real, especially not seeing what's real about us, what are some thoughts that come to mind for you and maybe even in your own experience?
Yeah, when I think of denial, like for me, and I would assume this to be true for others in addiction, is this tale of two cities. Because initially there's the denial that there's a problem. I still remember the first time I experienced being dope sick. Um, and this was back also when I was selling oxys. And I remember, this other individual that I used to run was he used to go down to Florida to the pill mills and come back. And so, anywho, he was late on coming back, and I had run out of everything, whether to sell or for my own use, the day before. And so, this is probably the first time in who knows how many months that I actually went an extended period of time without doing any oxys. And so I wake up the next day, and I remember waking up and being like, man, I don't feel so good. Like, I think I got the flu. And luckily for me, it was a day off of work. And so I was just kind of laying around and I was like, man, I feel like crap. Um, and he ended up getting back in town that afternoon and hit me up and said, hey, dude, roll over whenever. Everything's good. And I remember telling him, I was like, dude, I don't think I'm going to meet up with you. Like, dude, I just don't feel good. Like, I'll just hit you up tomorrow. And so I was laying there, then, my phone's blowing up because people want their drugs. And so, a few hours later, I was just like, just get up and go meet him and, you can make a little bit of money. And so anyhow, I go and meet him up, and headed back to my house. I stopped, and this is actually on Hudson Street, and there's a Shell gas station right there. And I stopped there because I needed gas. And so while I'm filling up gas, I remember just being like, oh, why don't you just, do one of these oxys and maybe it'll make your headache feel better. And so, I do one and, the typical, within 30 seconds, all of my symptoms were gone. And it was the first time where I was just like, was that withdrawals? I was like, no, that wasn't withdrawals. And I remember that and it was probably about a 15-minute drive home. I was in absolute denial. There's no way I'm a drug addict. There's no way I'm dependent upon these things. But then I was also like, I felt like crap, and now I feel perfectly fine. So then what is it? And so I remember for the first couple of days just completely denying the fact that I was a drug addict. Quote unquote, my body now was dependent upon the substance because I never thought that would be me. I was the kid in high school, when they had the person come and they talk about I'd be like, oh, look at this guy, what a loser. You're never going to become that. This is a waste of an hour. But then I was that guy. And so there's that initial, once you realize that your body's dependent upon something, I had that denial. And it took me a couple of days to be like, all right, so now what are you going to do? And then the other tale of the city, now it actually changes, I think. There's the denial that you have a problem. And then at the back end of the addiction, I feel like there's a denial that you're actually going to make it out of it. And so I had the denial that my life's actually not ever going to change. Like that feeling of once an addict, always an addict. Because like I said, my mom was my cheerleader and she was always, hey, you're going to make it out of this. You're going to make it out of this. This is not going to be at your end. But eventually you start being like, no, like this is my life. I'm never going to make it out of it. And so you have that tale of the two denials, that there's a problem. And then at the back end that there's no way I'm ever going to get out of this because life has shown you over the years that you try to quit. You try to do this and it just repeats itself. And after it repeats itself for so many years, the denial is that you're actually ever going to have a good life.
Mm. Is there a moment you can remember where you feel like you woke up to what was really going on, where the facade, the denial, kind of went away, and you realized that there was a problem?
I don't know about a specific time. It was more so of just like wrestling with the fact that I feel like I'm pretty observant where I'm just like, yeah, dude, those were withdrawals. Like you're dependent. Like obviously that, and there's still this idea of like, oh, I'm going to stop and get over this. Um, but yeah, I think I worked through that denial pretty quickly where I realized there was an issue. But then, I guess there could be a third part of the denial between the two was this idea like I thought just because like I've always been a good problem solver, and I've always been one of those people that I can solve my own problems for the most part, or I can work my way through it and just critically think for enough time and come up with a plan. And so my whole addiction, I never went to rehab because I didn't need rehab. Not that I didn't need to get off the drugs, but like I can solve my own problem off the drugs. And so my MO for those 8 years was I'm just going to go through being dope sick. I'll take time off of work like I always did. I took a week off of work. I would go through being dope sick. The first 7 days are always the worst days, and then going back to work still sucks, but it's not that bad. And the first time I did that, like I got like 6 or 7 months clean, which in my mind, I did it. But then I relapsed. And it was just like, oh, well, if I don't do A, good. And so quit again. I don't do A, but then I did B. And I got like another 6 months. But still, in my mind, I'm like, the denial was that I actually did beat addiction, but then I just made a dumb mistake. And so I think there was another denial piece there because I kept doing that over the years and through the years. And then eventually I had to realize that, there's multiple times I got jobs that required me to go to different parts of the state or go to different states. And I would always get sober before I went there. And I would always, the typical phrase you'll hear, new location, new me, new job, new me. And so that was always my mindset. Okay, I'm going to this other part, don't know anybody there. It's a fresh start. But what would always happen would either I or it would find me and then repeat. And so I think there's a denial piece there where like first it was like, I'm not a drug addict. And then the denial was, I don't really need treatment. I can solve this on my own. Then to the part of like, I'm never going to make it out of this.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you remember? I'm really curious. What was your mindset? It's a really interesting part of your story where you talk about how you took a week off work, right? You went through the worst parts of withdrawal, and then you were 6, 7 months clean. What was your mindset then when you chose to relapse? Like how did that happen? You were 6, 7 months clean, and this pattern started to develop of like relapsing, getting clean again. That especially that first time. What was going through your mind? Did you feel like it wasn't a big deal to partake again, or what was going on there in your mind and in your heart?
Yeah, I feel like all those times was just like I still enjoyed doing drugs, as far as like the oxys. And this is even before, a little bit before the heroin. Um, but I think the mindset was I had a problem, and obviously it resulted in a dependence into an addiction. But like my life still didn't spiral out of control at that point. You know what I'm saying? There's still a lot of good things. I had a job. Like I didn't really have any adverse recoil from those first couple times. I still had a job. I still had my own place, and relatively my relationships for the most part. And so it was just like, okay, now that I've gotten over this, then it's just like this idea of like, oh, I can party sometimes. I can party on the weekends like I used to without the necessity of, daily using, which I think that was probably my mindset early on was just like, you had a problem, but it's really not that bad because look around and, you're not homeless and you're not this and you're not that. So like, just have better self-control.
Gotcha. Gotcha.
But I don't think I refrained because I still wanted to party and use, for some, the various reasons.
Yeah. What helped you get into reality? Because we're kind of going to talk to that about that in a minute. Is how do we stay honest? How do we stay grounded in what's real, right? How do we remain in reality? How do we remain honest? Especially when honesty feels like maybe a weakness, or we have to be vulnerable, and maybe that shame and stigma comes up, right? Like we talked about community. Like I think the first aspect that comes to mind that we want to talk about is like building safe relationships. I think when we're in unhealthy patterns, unhealthy behaviors, addictions, we sometimes surround ourselves with people in that space, which can be a negative influence. So we're trying to build healthy relationships. We're trying to maybe develop relationships with people that are trying to better themselves, et cetera, which can also be challenging because that we got to be honest, and that can mean accountability. That can mean struggle. But what did that look like for you? When do you feel like you really started to get honest? What did that look like?
Yeah, it's a good question. I was trying to think while you were speaking, and for the most part, I was always very honest. At least with my parents and with my sister, that every time I did kind of fall on my face, not every single time, but most times I kind of told them. Um, but fast forwarding into this like that moment of being honest. And I think you said this podcast was, the courage. And so it's like, I was kind of punched into submission to actually be brave. But like, I talked about like through my whole addiction is just like this idea of like, I don't need professional help. You can solve your own problems and you can use your mind to solve yourself out of addiction. As you can imagine, over 8 years, it's a long time of being stubborn and thinking that you can do this by yourself. But it took me 8 years to be just pummeled to the point of just humility, but really a bad state of humility, where I finally was able, because my family tried to get me to come into the refuge a few years earlier. Now, I didn't know it was the refuge. I just remember talking to somebody on the phone, and I was just like, yeah, I'm not doing that. Like, I want to keep my job, and so I'm just going to do what I always do, and I'm just going to do it. And so I finally came to the point where I had to look back over the 8 years and realizing nothing's changed. Yeah, you maybe got 6 months or 4 months or 5 months, and you have no problem quitting and you have no problem tolerating the dope sickness. But at the end of the day, here you are again. And then obviously you do heroin for 8 years, your life kind of slowly gets worse and worse and worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. And it literally took me to the point of like, lost my job, lost my apartment, pretty much living out of my car or wherever I could find a spot to finally be honest and say, all right, dude, maybe you actually need professional treatment. Because up until that point for 8 years, you couldn't convince me to go somewhere because I knew better. Because I was going to rely on my own fortitude and my own all that. And so I finally had to be the honest I've ever been as far as courage and brave to say, I actually need help and I need professional help.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I still remember
Yeah.
that. It was a Wednesday at 3 o'clock in the morning. I texted my sister and said, I'm done and I'm ready. Can you call so and so? And can you still get me into that place?
Yeah. So it sounds like a big component of you getting honest was realizing like, I need help. I need help. I can't do this on my own, which, right, is kind of like you think about AA, like the big book, like step one, right? Like, I can't do this on my own. My life has become unmanageable. And getting to that space where I realize I can't, right? But God can, like, and I need others. Like, I'm a human being that is not self-sufficient. It sounds like, which is hard for human beings because I think all of us have a natural tendency to believe that we can fix ourselves and we can do it on our own. And no matter what the addiction, the form of the addiction or the struggle, that's almost always never true. Like, we're made for relationship. We need other people. And so you begin to name that reality, right? I know that's what I've needed to do. Like, I've got to come to terms with the fact that like, this has become unmanageable on my own. I can't do this on my own. I need other people. I need people in my life that aren't just going to facilitate and enable my behavior. Like, I need to be challenged. I need other people in my life. And obviously like rehab and is just an intense example of that, a short, intense example. Um, like, we tend to think that freedom, right, is like, freedom is me being able to fix myself. But I think the freedom we're talking about is as honesty, accountability is actually the place to true freedom. It releases us from the shame. And so I think for anybody maybe struggling with that, am I in reality? Maybe a question that we should ask ourselves is like, am I minimizing my behavior? Are there things that I'm avoiding? Am I telling the truth? Or am I just telling a version of the truth that's easy? Because honesty is often difficult, and it's often um, it's gonna involve us saying things that aren't necessarily nice and clean and fun. The truth hurts sometimes, and I think if we've lived in denial for a long time, we're gonna have to find a new way, and honesty is gonna take a lot of courage. It's gonna take a lot of courage. Um, one thing that we wrote down here, right? The real battle in recovery isn't just behavior; it's truth versus illusion. Um, there's a scripture passage in the Bible that talks about, Jesus talking about himself, but he's like, I'm the truth, right? But he says, like, the truth will set you free. And I think, unfortunately, when we're in our struggles, when we're in darkness and evil and addiction, um, those things blind us from reality. They blind us from the truth. And even like you talked about in your own story, it was like this descent into this theoretical hell. It's always a descent into something worse. Whereas the truth sets us free, but the truth often, it's hard at first. It's difficult. We'd rather hide. We'd rather pretend. We'd rather feel like we're in control, where recovery says, tell the truth, live in reality, let someone in, let God in. But it starts with like being honest with myself, being honest with something. I love, another thing Rich Plass often says, he says, like, not everyone needs to know what's going on, but somebody better know what the hell's going on. And I think for many of us, we try to hold on to control and cover up our stuff until we can't anymore, right? We can't anymore. And honesty may feel like vulnerability, but in reality, it's strength. Um, and it's where we find our freedom. It's where we find healing. James 1:9 talks about. It's a verse I've been really leaning into lately. It's like, confess your sin to one another, and you'll be healed. There's something in confession is just another word. Like, tell the truth to yourself. Confess. Tell your truth to someone else that you trust. Tell the truth to God. And I think that's where we find a God who's incredibly gracious, incredibly loving. That's wanting to take us towards the path to flourishing rather than destruction. Um, so I don't know. It's so encouraging to hear, but as you heard me just kind of go on a rant there, is there anything else that comes to mind when you think about people that might be struggling in that space of being able to be honest?
Yeah, when you were talking, I was already just like having flashbacks and thinking of this, that concept that you talked about as far as from illusion to truth. And just, I kind of thought about my own story. And it's just like, when you're in active addiction and you're in that addiction for a long period of time, like you are living in a state of illusion. Like there is no objective truth. And I remember like telling myself, here I am is sleeping in my car in the middle of summer that had no AC. And the moment that I got high, I would be in that car and be like, this really isn't that bad. This is kind of nice. I can do this, and it's just like, there is no reality of being in the car, no AC and sleeping in there and essentially living out of it. That's okay. But if I got high, I'd be like, this is kind of nice. And then it's just like, but like, it's so hard when you're in a state of illusionary living, when you don't know truth from left or right. It's so hard to get from that into actually being truthful, even to embrace, you know, objective truth, let alone, embrace subjective, let alone objective. But like what I share with you about like that Wednesday morning at 3 o'clock in the morning when I text my sister, that was like I finally kind of broke that threshold because I actually admitted to something that I hadn't admitted to myself, but I knew was real. And that was, I am going to die if I don't change. But up until most of this point, no matter how bad it got, I was just like, it's really not that bad. Like, yeah, I've seen friends die. I've pumped enough chests of people that I did drugs with that overdosed, but like, that's never going to happen to me, you know? But those last couple of months when things got really bad, like I started being like, you're going to die. I would think about it and dismiss it and be like, no, no, no. But that night, was when I finally actually admitted to myself and actually said out loud, if I don't change something, I'm going to die. And I don't want to die hating myself and hating my life. And that was the whole reason for me to finally say, I need professional help, is because I started understanding what's going to happen. And I didn't want to die. Not alone die, but like I hated myself at that point and I hated my life. And I was like, there can't be another worse way to go out than that. And so I kind of, when you were talking, I was like, that's exactly what happened. I was in the state of disillusionment. And then all of a sudden I had that moment of like, this is the truth. And if you don't change it, this is what's going to happen. And so I was finally willing to be brave and have some courage and be like, you're going to die. Do something about it. And I actually reached out and said, take me to that place. And then the rest is history. But imagine if I just kept telling myself, that's not going to be you. That's not going to be you. Those are other people. They're going to die. You're not going to die. You just never know when it's going to happen if you're constantly in that state of mind.
Man, that's so good. I appreciate your vulnerability even on this and just telling a part of your story. It's very encouraging. And I'm hoping it resonates with people listening. And if it did, share it with someone you trust. I think that we can do more than we think we can. It's hard to be honest, but if you don't know where to start, find someone who you know is going to push you in the right direction and be honest. And I think that's the start. That's the beginning. We've got to get out of that, like you said, that out of the illusion and into the light, which is getting honest. And that's one of the first parts. I can't do this on my own. I need help. We all do. And I think that's the beginning of real change. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Relational Recovery Podcast. We'll be back soon with a new conversation. We'll see you then.